Hello, everyone. This is a new podcast, kind of a discussion idea we had for like a historical comedy review of various things that we find kind of like niche historical topics that are funny.
Yes.
Um, in some manner, they're funny. Um, and this episode is
Kleptocracy in the Congo.
it's a great name, and it's about uh, Mobutu, who was the leader of Zaire, which we'll get into in a minute.
Yep.
My name's Sal,
I'm Jordan.
and we are the hosts. Um,
So how did you learn about Mobutu and why are you interested in this subject?
I am interested in Mobutu and other funny things because generally in history, I like the Cold War is a specific era that is like very interesting to me. And Third World Cold War stuff is usually where stuff is happening. Like the focus of all, like the battlegrounds and like a lot of the historical stories are there. And um, my political interest in like third world nationalist movements lead to a bunch of different avenues, but one of them that I saw repeated is Mobutu, as being like whenever he was mentioned, there was this kind of like um, way that he was like referenced as like a special example of certain things that are stereotypes about like third world leaders, sort of, during the Cold War, specifically like American U.S. puppets.
But that are absolutely true
Yes.
in his case.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, he's like the shining example, and the more at first I didn't really look into him too much. I just kind of briefly was like, okay, he's like, I wrote it off. But it was only until I really started looking into more of the details that, like, the fact that this is like there's a lot of amusement to be found in the details here. So, same question to you though.
So I got interested in Mobutu and the Congo slash Zaire. I want to say about 10 years ago now. I read the Library of Congress country study. I come from a very similar background of being interested in third world national liberation movements and the history of them and sort of their fate. My kind of abiding interest outside of the fact that Mobutu is just very bombastic and funny, which I think we should just say right at the outset, we both hate Mobutu.
Yeah, we're not fans.
But there's a quote that I would just like to read from the Library of Congress country study that kind of just encapsulates my kind of perspective and why I find the whole situation interesting. So it says on page 63, this is written in 1993, by the way. Zaire is a land of superlative natural endowments, a vast territory encompassing enormous mineral deposits, immense forests, mighty rivers, and abundant fertile soils. It is said to have sufficient arable land and hydroelectric potential to feed and power the entire African continent. This situation, in combination with its legendary mineral wealth, should have made Zaire one of sub-Saharan Africa's most developed and wealthiest states. Instead, it is a poor nation in a rich land. Its economy and society are in disarray in the early 1990s, and most of its citizens, 80% by some accounts, live in absolute poverty. So I think that just kind of sums up like this kind of situation where a whole country is just totally held back from its potential because of the political structure and the outside influences. So.
Yeah, and it's like a special example, like the contrast between what they have in resources and like what is currently like when historically the case for their country. It begs the question why to someone reading about it or researching it. So we're not going to go through like a super boring historical account of things.
Right.
Like this is kind of a thing to figure out what we find kind of humorous in this. So we do have a structure where we will go through some stuff, but
that'll be topical, not chronological. Yeah,
exactly. Another thing that we kind of are doing is there's a few different points that we've both selected about this that are our favorites
in our research. Yeah.
in our research that we're going to share with each other. Some that, like, I have a few that you know about already.
Yeah.
And I have one that I have not revealed.
Right.
So,
Same. I have kind of just a favorite little factoid or incident that I have not disclosed to him, and we'll point those out when we get to them.
Yeah. They'll come up at various points throughout it. So.
Right. And speaking of our research, we're not writing a thesis on this topic. We both read a fair amount over the years on Mobutu, but in preparing for this episode, we mostly relied on, obviously, Wikipedia, the Zaire, a country study, which is free. And if you've never heard of this before, this was a program by the Library of Congress until 2004, where they would put out very comprehensive surveys of a particular country, and especially coming from our kind of political persuasion, we would normally be somewhat skeptical of this.
Yeah.
But I'd say with quite a degree of confidence that even though they are written from like by U.S. diplomats, and they definitely come from a perspective, and they obviously have things that they value and are against, I'd say that they're pretty good in terms of neutrality.
Yeah.
So
Usually they're just trying to present information for like a utilitarian purpose.
yes,
Sometimes they'll say something that's like an opinion, but usually it's just like what it is.
right. It's essentially factual. So what was the other book that you used?
I have a book written by someone who was like a journalist in Zaire. Towards the end, he did his own research, so this is going off some of the things that he's accounted. It's called "In the Footsteps of Mr. Kurtz" by Michelle Wrong, I believe.
I think on that we should say we don't speak French, and the some of the names, some of the French names and some of the African names, we might kind of struggle with at times.
Yeah, I will definitely butcher names and maybe even a few words, but that's how it goes. But yeah, so our sources, we can't verify all of this 100% for every single thing, but a lot of it is a series of things that make it very plausible that this is at least true or mostly true. Or
yes, and we also omitted, even though some of them were amusing, things that we found kind of doubtful and couldn't find support for in other sources.
Especially if they're important.
Yeah. So do you want to go just right into the historical background?
Yeah, you want to do that?
Sure. So if you're not familiar,
where is Zaire?
So Zaire is a very large country that nowadays is called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is in Central Africa. It borders several other states,
which is relevant for later.
Yes, which will come up later. So it gained its independence as the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 1960.
From who?
From Belgium. There's some of the sort of continuity between the two, which we'll talk about at several points. But to make a very, very large subject succinct, there's been a ton of ink devoted to this subject over the decades. When Congo, and there's two Congos, but we'll strictly just be referring to the Democratic Republic of the Congo throughout this.
And Zaire.
And Zaire. Yeah. It gained its independence in 1960. Its prime minister was a guy named Patrice Lumumba. And pretty much right after independence, the former colonial army mutinied for several reasons, but it's not really important to the story. And it plunged the government immediately into a crisis. To resolve the crisis and get the country back under control, Lumumba appealed to the Soviet Union, which at the time was very interested in helping national liberation movements.
Very anti-colonial.
Yeah, very anti-colonial. And in the midst of that, the southern province of Congo, which is called Katanga, which is where the majority of the colonial mining interests were, it seceded, declared independence from the rest of the country, and pretty much started a multi-sided civil war. After the prime minister appealed for Soviet help, the president, Kasavubu, attempted to oust him, and in response, the prime minister attempted to oust the president. The parliament attempted a national reconciliation between the two, but in steps our protagonist or antagonist of this story, Mobutu, launched a coup against both of them and remained in power with a technocratic government. He eventually relinquished control, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened in between. There was a Maoist insurgency, there was a UN intervention against Katanga, but basically the country came back under control by about 1965.
By who?
Well, there was elections, and the winning coalition was actually headed by the former prime minister of Katanga, and Mobutu launched another coup in 1965. And this is basically the start of our story.
Yes.
So typically, if you look at Mobutu's reign, it's normally counted from 1965 until 1997.
Yeah, and that's what we'll be pretty much covering.
Yeah.
One historical note before we get into the meat of this and the funnier parts is like the Belgian colonial structure of Congo, and just like Belgian colonialism in the previous century was like very brutal.
Yeah.
And they were like one of the
rubber mining. Yeah.
Yeah, they were very notorious and like exploitative to say the least.
Yeah.
We won't go into too much of that, but
oh, and also I kind of left out of that overview, which some people are probably shaking their heads at. Throughout this entire crisis, it's called the Congo crisis, Belgium, this is kind of our unholy trinity in this story.
yeah.
Belgium, France, and the United States were wildly supportive of Katanga.
They helped kill Lumumba, who was the guy who headed the anti-colonial stuff.
I totally left that out. Yes,
that's a huge thing because he's like a George Washington, but even like
yeah, he's revered in Congo
and in Africa.
Yeah, and so that kind of colonial interest will remain throughout our story, but it had its roots in the prior colonial period, but also during the early independence. Belgium, France, and the United States were deeply involved in this.
They'll stay involved in the story.
Yes.
One just like side note before we get into about the Belgian colonialism, the King Leopold II, who was the Belgian king, at one point owned Congo as his private property. It wasn't a colony; it was like his land that he owned the deed to. Basically, eventually he gave that up, but like that's not typical at all.
Right, and actually, it didn't become a colony, strictly speaking, until there was heavy international pressure in Europe because of how utterly brutal the laboring conditions were, and they pretty much forced the Kingdom of Belgium to nationalize the territory as a colony. So it was somehow even worse before that, and that was in 1908.
Yeah. Jeez.
Do you want to get into the grift or?
Yes. Should we talk about the dynamics of the region at all throughout the years? Like what
would you have in mind?
Just like why the U.S. Why is it Mobutu was like around?
Yeah.
Just like not because there's other parts where we'll go into it, but like the dynamics of why he was supported by the United States.
Yeah. So do you want me to go into that?
Yeah.
So like to answer this kind of issue, some of the seeds of it are we went over with the Congo crisis, where in the south in Katanga there was and I alluded to this in my quotation where I sort of laid out why I'm interested. Congo has some of the richest mineral resources in the entire world. They're one of the top producers of copper and cobalt and several other important minerals. They also possess uranium,
Yeah.
like the Manhattan Project that made the atomic bombs used uranium from the Belgian
It's
Congo.
not in a lot of places.
Right, it's very, very rare. And so it's just filled with tons of natural resources. And so the kind of abiding imperialist interest in the country comes from that fact.
And because of all around them, there's these anti-colonial movements that were aligned to varying degrees to anti-Europe, anti-US, like anti-capitalist type
Yeah.
movements, and the fear of this resource-rich place engulfed in conflict like that, or joining with like the left wing of the world, was like a disastrous
Yeah.
thing for them to happen. So Mobutu was well kept after by European powers
Yes.
and the United States.
And it going along with my introductory quotation, about how it should be the richest, most industrially advanced country on the continent. Just imagine if like a socialist government was in power and they used those things to sort of fund the anti-colonialist struggle. It would be a disaster for Western capitalism.
Yeah.
So
Okay. From there, we can go on to the I guess the thesis, or like the overarching like thing that a lot of the amusement is drawn from. Just another note is like we are not like mocking the people who suffered from this,
Right.
or like saying that even when it's funny stuff that's happening, that it's like something good, or even like,
or that we're glad it happened.
yeah, definitely not.
No.
Um,
But kind of the thesis of Mobutu's reason to be is what we're just going to kind of shorthandedly refer to as the grift.
yeah, the grift.
So basically, if you've never heard of this guy before, he is very, very infamous for having embezzled amounts of money that are kind of difficult to pin down, but the typical estimate is between 5 and 15 billion dollars.
Yeah.
And this is in 1965 to 97 money. Most of which he stole. Well, we don't know 100% for sure, but he was, well past his first billion by the year 1970.
Yeah.
So you can just kind of round that up in your head of the value of, and this is in US dollars.
Yeah.
The value of money back then.
Yeah. It was a lot.
In a country that is very.
Well, we'll get into some of the conditions of the country.
Yes.
But yeah, the grift. What is the grift?
So the grift, do you want me to get into that?
Yeah, start it.
So the grift is basically that Mobutu was this kind of colonial puppet head of state for this country, and he unabashedly used his position to just embezzle enormous amounts of money from the state treasury, foreign aid.
Yeah, they got a lot of foreign aid connected to the thing we talked about earlier from like Western powers.
Yes. They threw money at him. They kind of spoiled him.
And he pocketed a lot of it.
And there was no questions asked until much later in our story.
Yeah.
So do we want to get into Mobutu's infamous speech?
Yeah, because I think that really is the thing that highlights all of this, like in context. Like, what is the speech that you're talking about?
So I would like to connect this to, I guess, what you could call the direct grift and the indirect grift.
Yeah.
Which is Mobutu and his goons were not secretive about what they were up to in terms of thieving the nation's wealth and taxes and all that stuff. And so it had like this effect in the society where everybody knew it was going on. And because the conditions were of such privation, it basically required that everybody kind of behave like him in a certain
And
manner.
join in on his grifting with their own, like, connected to him. Like, it was
Right.
a fostering this thing that, like, it it made it, that's how you do it.
Yeah.
Like, that's like how things are done here.
So do you want to read the short quotation from the speech?
Sure. Uh, so in a speech that he delivered on the 20th of May in 76, it was in a football stadium in Kinshasa, which is
The
like the
capital.
capital of the entire country. It was filled with like 70,000 people apparently. Um, at some point in this speech, he said this quote: "If you want to steal, steal a little in a nice way. But if you steal too much to become rich overnight, you will be caught." Which
Yep.
is the funniest. Like, he said this to 70,000 people.
And presumably it was carried on the radio and
Passed along.
in the media that this is just kind of the maxim from the commander in chief is, don't be too blatant. Arguably he would be too blatant.
This was more for the people who joined him.
Yes.
He was blatant, but you don't get caught.
Right, don't get caught.
Yeah, because in 1970, it was estimated that he had stolen 60% of the national budget of that year, which is insanity.
Yeah.
That's like unimaginable.
And so what makes it possible, of course, is that his guys were the ones that were in charge of accounting and, what were these funds used for,
Yeah.
and all that stuff.
And we'll get into some of the dynamics of how that all works
Right.
soon too.
So there is one thing I'd like to go over before we move on about the lavish quality
Yeah.
of Mobutu's spending habits, because not only was he wildly corrupt, but of course going along with it, he had unbelievably extravagant taste.
Yes. So like we should talk a little bit after with this about who Mobutu is, like, personally.
Okay. So according to Pierre Jansen, which was the ex-husband of Mobutu's daughter Yaki, this is a quotation from Mobutu's Wikipedia article. Mobutu had no concern for the cost of expensive gifts he gave away to his cronies. Jansen, which is the guy talking, he married Mobutu's daughter in a lavish ceremony that included 3 orchestras, a $65,000 wedding cake, and a giant fireworks display. Yaki, Mobutu's daughter, wore a $70,000 wedding gown and $3 million worth of jewels. Jansen wrote a book describing Mobutu's daily routine, which included several daily bottles of wine, retainers flown in from overseas, and lavish meals, which the retainers from overseas is another thing. I guess we could probably talk about that right now,
Yeah.
too. So Mobutu...
Like, picture this, right? You're in Africa,
right.
which is in the throes of a myriad of anti-colonial ideological fights against their former colonial masters
Mm-hmm.
and to develop their own country. Specifically, in Mobutu's case, with Belgium and Zaire and Congo, they were really bad
Right.
to the Congolese.
Yeah,
Like-
and they were widely despised. The former Belgian masters were widely despised throughout the country. It's one of the reasons why Patrice Lumumba
Was so popular.
was so popular, because in a famous speech in, I believe, 1959, he, without repeating what he said, he really gave it directly to the King of Belgium, saying, we're not your lackeys anymore. He used a different word,
Yeah.
but so this was a very common sentiment. So against that backdrop, what Mobutu would get up to, because running the country, which as we'll describe later, his goal was basically to not run it. So he would hang out with European aristocrats.
Fancy parties.
Yeah, fancy parties and shopping sprees, hanging out in Paris and Brussels. He would take the Concorde. Is that just a plane or is that an airline?
It's just his plane, I think.
Okay. and he would just hang out and sort of spoil himself with the nation's riches, hanging out with, Belgian royalty and stuff.
Make allies in the Belgian banks and stuff, and
Mhm.
basically earn support and money to embezzle later.
Which, like, just the image itself of Congo, like,
Yeah.
probably the most that I can easily think of, the most brutal.
It's stated that King Leopold II genocided the Congolese.
Yeah,
very often.
That's like a fairly mainstream academic opinion at this point.
Yeah.
And so the image of this guy going and hanging out with the former rulers is
Drinking fancy beer and
Yeah.
yeah, it's scandalous and disgusting, but
Yeah.
also somewhat amusing to see
how bold
it was.
and brazen. Yeah, so there's a this is also from Mobutu's wiki page, is sort of describing the social reflection of the grift and how pervasive it was. There's a popular saying that the civil servants pretended to work while the state pretended to pay them, because as another sort of connective tissue that we'll see over and over again in this story, is the funds of the central government were so thoroughly embezzled constantly
down the chain, like a reverse pyramid chain.
Yeah.
Just like the payment would just be siphoned away until it got to the bottom.
In which case, civil servants, soldiers, people
Ambassadors?
with government jobs, yes, ambassadors, they wouldn't be paid for shockingly long periods of
months
time.
or years.
Months
at some
or
point.
years, yeah.
Which, helped the indirect grift. It incentivized them to also steal stuff
Yes.
to make their living and survive.
Because you never know when the next installment,
Yeah.
if or when it's going to come.
Yeah. Another quote by him is that everything is for sale and everything can be bought in this country. And in this trade, the slightest access to power constitutes a veritable instrument of exchange. So you just need your foot in the door
Mhm.
and you can start grifting and stealing stuff.
Yep.
And it's like a American dream, but like of
Centered
thieving,
around a
like-
guy, yeah.
yeah.
So do we want to talk about how, like, political life worked in this country?
Yeah, and the mechanisms of the government.
Yeah. One thing we didn't get into in the historical survey is that after Mobutu's coup in 1965, Mobutu sort of, in a self-serving way, kind of pushed this idea that politics and politicians, like, it's just a bad, inherently divisive thing. It basically means they're cronies and corrupt, even though Mobutu is both of those things. So sort of part of the political ethos of Mobutu's new state was that we're gonna do away with political parties and sort of politicians. Well, not really politicians, but sort of political life was not going to be this problematic, divisive thing.
Where you discuss policy and like
Right.
have parties argue about stuff. It was-
Right. So Mobutu instituted a single party system. His party was called the MPR, which is the Popular Movement of the Revolution, which this is another trend that we'll see is he liked to co-opt sort of radical ideas and radical terminology. We'll get into the political ideology of his party a little bit later, but do you want to talk about the 1970 election?
Yeah, we could do that.
Okay.
Go. You can do this one.
Okay, so in the 1970 election, so even though it was a single party state, if you're not familiar with these kinds of things, you might be thinking, why would a single party state have elections? It's really common, regardless of, like, are they a left-wing single party state or a right-wing one or whatever. They still have elections. They're kind of pointless, but they still formally happen.
And they're a big production.
Yeah, it's if
a show.
if anything else, it's to sort of build up support for, like, the ruling establishment, like, whatever political persuasion they are. So in 1970, for the presidential elections, Mobutu was the only candidate. Voting was not secret. voters chose a green paper if they supported Mobutu's candidacy, and a red paper if they opposed it. Casting a green ballot was deemed a vote for hope, while a red ballot was deemed a vote for chaos. Under the circumstances, the result was inevitable. According to official figures, Mobutu was confirmed in office with near unanimous support, garnering over 10 million votes to only 157 no votes. It later emerged that almost 30,500 more votes were cast than the actual number of registered voters. So, you know.
And to paint a little picture of like Zaire's condition at this time, it was very underdeveloped, and lots of the country was not. It wasn't like a urban
Right.
metropolis everywhere, and like it wasn't even that unified in terms of like the infrastructure.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Now, if you thought that the 1970 elections weren't too promising, do you want to read about?
no, I'll do the next. I'll do this.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Which version would you like me to read?
Read both.
Okay, so this I very vividly recall reading this piece of information for the first time.
This is one of the humorous parts that really drove us into this.
Yeah. So after those elections in 1970, they had them again 5 years later. So in 1975, they had parliamentary elections, which it was still under the single party system. But they dispensed with formal voting, and this is on Mobutu's wiki. Instead, the elections took place by acclaim. Candidates were presented at public locations around the country where they could be applauded. So they basically just took these Mobutu corrupt functionaries and had people just sort of cheer and clap for them.
They rounded people up, and they're like, "Hey, here's the guys, clap for them."
And that's they're legitimate now.
It's like, all right, good.
So
Glad we did this.
So this is referred to, if you read several sources on this era, it's called like the election by acclaim or other terms like that. But it's a very funny idea that just sort of,
Yeah, it's like a complete farce and show.
Yeah.
That is very like, cause another big thing with Mobutu is his personal image of himself.
Yes.
Because like we said, it's scandalous that he was with these Belgian kings and no like aristocrats.
Yeah.
But he didn't present himself as a colonial lackey. He
No.
presented himself as this bold leader who could wine and dine with these formidable heads of state.
Like he was, and I would agree that he was charismatic.
Definitely.
He was also a colonial lackey and very corrupt, but he did have this certain charm to him.
Yeah, he didn't dress up in like European clothing and stuff. Like he wasn't like against Africans.
No.
In like theoretically, like he promoted African stuff.
Yeah,
and he dressed in a way to like
he could
have pride in it.
He could do both. Yeah. He wasn't, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about his political ideology. But I don't think that you could say that Mobutu had some sort of inferiority complex.
No.
Or that he had some kind of internalized racism or something like that. Mobutu, while rubbing shoulders with these people that it just looks awful for him to be doing, he'd be wearing like a leopard skin hat and like kind of outwardly African sort of clothing, and he would carry himself in a way that he really cares about his country, but he also really likes taking all their money and
all of your money
if you're listening to this from the United States,
that too.
we have given a humongous amount that lined this guy's pocket. But that, I think it's an important point to understanding Mobutu is he somehow was kind of an Africanist in sort of a way.
Yeah.
In a very, very superficial way.
Yes.
But I think his image of himself was that, he was not like trying to be European or something
Definitely
like
not.
that.
He wanted to be respected amongst his own people and the world stage.
Yeah.
And the way he did that was by being extremely rich.
Yes, yes. So, now that we've talked about the elections, do we want to talk about how Mobutu's government actually worked?
Yeah, so like Congo, Zaire, in this case, which again is the same thing, was very like in need of a government, a stat like it's kind of hard, especially for Western people,
Oh,
if they haven't studied to understand.
yeah. So when Congo got its independence in 1960, there were less than 100 university degree holders in the entire country.
And the roads were almost completely from the previous century, like and like early
Yeah.
20th century colonial stuff. That's like it wasn't like there was highways or
Right. The roads were to connect mining and rubber resources to the port.
yeah,
It was not to connect people to schools or
even the capital in some cases.
right. Yeah.
So it was that's just one example of infrastructure being very bad.
Yeah.
So generally in a country that earns their independence and makes a government, these are things that they start to develop no matter what their ideology is,
Yeah.
because it's how you build a country out from.
Being a colony.
Yes.
Yeah.
That really didn't happen much with Mobutu at all. And one of the things that he would do that helped that not happen is with his cabinet. It's like one thing he would do is like he had his members of his government, like the highest levels around him,
Which he appointed.
would. So like you have a minute, like a what do they call it?
Like a minister of defense.
Minister
or-
of transportation,
Yeah.
education, all those things. He would change who was in those positions yearly or sometimes a few times a year
Mhm.
and just shuffle them around. He wouldn't just fire them and like you'd think
Right.
like a dictator
Right.
stereotypically would like kill them or like exile them.
Right.
No. He'd take like the minister of transportation and put him as the minister of education.
Regardless of, does he have any background in this? Is he familiar with the institutions in the country? It has nothing to do with efficiency.
In fact, it has the opposite. It's
Right.
because it's inefficient.
Right.
So swatching, like, imagine getting a new job that required you to oversee something of a country every 6 months or
Right.
something. It was crazy. So yeah, one of the things that it was intended to do is to prevent anyone from making connections or having influence
Right.
or being able to like establish anything. They'd be swapped around, so they'd have to start over basically
Right.
their careers and their position.
It was a self-preservation thing for Mobutu, because he was one of the motivating things is throughout all of this is A, he's got to protect the grift.
Yeah.
And sort of part of that is B, there cannot be a coup or an overthrow of him personally.
Because a lot of like colonial puppets of the West will have coups where like someone underneath them overthrows them, and a lot of the time it's not to get rid of the colonial connection or like the imperialist
Right.
like alliance. It's just to take over,
Right.
and like nothing would change for like the colonialists. It was
Right.
just pretty much just internal stuff.
New face, the same thing.
Who's gonna get paid basically?
Right.
So yeah, he'd reshuffle ministers, and that's why like you go on their wikis, there'd be like you read anyone, it's like, oh, blank was the minister of agriculture and transportation and the ambassador of some country and then this, and it's like, oh my, like how does that happen? And this is how.
So, but yeah, between November 65 and April 97, Mobutu reshuffled his cabinet 60 times.
That's incredibly high.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have people who have no idea how to transportation, which there was none really public.
Right.
It's like that's why there was no roads were being built.
Right.
No public transportation, no complex education system could be made.
Right. Because you always had new people who had no idea of how to handle their newest assignment. But what they did do is they would use the new position to just carry out the grift.
Yeah. So like one thing they would do is they would have like every time they got a position, like a new minister, they would fill that their like under like the people under them, the people working for them, with people who they know,
Right.
so they could join in on
Right.
the
Like
thieving, basically.
family connections and
Friends,
ethnic
stuff.
yeah.
Um, and then it's also said that like when someone was switched in, the people under them who they appointed,
The person, the outgoing person appointed, yeah.
they wouldn't really fire or get rid of the previous staff for that person.
Right.
They'd just add more jobs.
Right.
And then that person would then get his friends, family, and like local ethnic people in the position. So there'd just be like multiplying degrees of these people who do the same job.
Right.
And are getting paid.
They all have their hands in the pot to some extent.
Another thing that would happen is like if people opposed him or he suspected, that was a big thing, like that they might gaining too much influence.
Right.
He might remove them and torture them.
Right.
But then there's like a lot of cases where even after being like tortured and fired and like denounced, like a few months later they'd give it another major position in the government and everything was fine.
And they would accept it.
Yeah, and they were like, all right, thanks. Like it was part of the like there was one who he got brutally tortured. He left the country on a trip with his family, started appealing. He appealed to like the U.S. Congress. He wrote articles and books about the torture and like trying to expose Mobutu, called for his downfall. And then Mobutu just forgave him and invited him back and gave him a job, and the dude accepted. And he was like damaged for life from what had happened to them. And it was just like, yeah, whatever. It's like there was no hard feelings. It's like time to earn money again.
Yeah. So sort of going along with the prior figure that I think I gave out, between 65 and 90, there was 51 governments. So an average of 2 a year. I know this is not normally how this is used in like American terminology, but a government is basically a cabinet.
It's basically like when a new election happens in the U.S.
Yeah.
And like the president forms a new government.
They appoint like the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Agriculture, all those things. So basically twice a year there would be a whole new, not new faces, but that, you know, face A, B, and C would be in different posts.
Yeah, they'd reshuffle them.
Yeah.
And because of this thing where like they multiply how many people are working for the government based on like people inviting people they know and like getting people in on this grift, it's said that in the central bank in the 90s had 3,000 people in it working for it who basically just shuffled paperwork, and there was only 2,000 people who worked for private banks in the country.
Right.
Which there was way more private. Right. There's like one central bank. So it's like an incredible figure for like one bank.
Yeah, there's tons of redundancy from just, you know, I don't know, what would you call it? Like patronage?
Yeah, it's like I imagine a lot of these people didn't even show up for work. They were just on the pay.
Right. They're kind of like phantoms on the payroll.
They collected paychecks or didn't.
Right.
Depending on the time. But like, what do you think? A lot of the like, why didn't he have people build roads and like communications and like all that stuff? Like, why was that not a priority? Well, I have my theories. So
what I would say to that is it's a couple of things. So one of them is that it would interfere with his bottom line.
Which is the most important thing.
Which is the most important, but sort of associated with that, or kind of protecting it, is I really think at a certain point Mobutu just didn't want the normal sort of working people in the country to just have much contact with each other.
Yeah.
So like they're outside of Kinshasa and Lumumbashi,
which are major cities
that have millions of people living in them. Outside of that, I think the country study says something like 70% of people worked in subsistence agriculture.
So it's like villages, towns.
Right. People producing purely just for their own consumption. And so I think like at a certain point, it's like the more roads and things, and this is not even to say like a public transit system.
Yeah.
I think that part of the calculus on Mobutu's part was I just don't want these people getting together, realizing, oh, hey, these other people from another part in the country have as desperate a living situation as I do. And, they can go into like the cities and see how just crazy kleptocratic it is,
Yeah.
and start forming ideas of maybe we should get rid of this guy.
Yeah, he didn't want people to talk because the only thing to talk about is how shitty he's made everyone's life.
Right.
Or like different villages, like he'd invite leaders of it to come and like he'd get them in on the grift.
Mm-hmm.
He'd pay them off. They'd go back with some token money.
Right.
Spread that around, and it would seem really cool because they don't know better.
Right.
Because he keeps them there. Like there's no development.
Right.
It's very hard to travel anyway because there's a bunch of dirt roads.
Mm-hmm.
If there's that. So that's what I think too. Especially considering all of his neighbors had people with ideology.
Yes.
That kind of like, we'll get to that in a minute, but like,
he
didn't want ideas.
Yeah, he didn't want the people getting ideas.
No.
Especially when with sort of any kind of communications, it would be incredibly easy for the common people to be getting, for Mobutu, very dangerous ideas towards him. If, for example, if we're in the mid-70s, if they knew anything about what was going on in Angola at the time, which we'll return to that. But so kind of getting into these sort of motives, did you want to talk about what his ideology is?
Well, before we get to that, like one thing I want to talk about is like people often in like a lot of these articles and like just things I see in people writing stuff that they're not referencing necessarily like about him, like historical stuff, call him totalitarian.
Yes.
Which is a term I don't really like using much at all because it's just kind of like vague and like not valuable.
It's also just like a name to call somebody.
Yeah.
And that gets into whole sorts of questions of like how feasible is that in the first place?
Like, what does it mean? It's not so like that we won't call him that because we think it's insulting. It's just it's not valuable. It's like calling him stupid. It's just like
right.
It's not a political term that
right.
is really valuable. But like generally what it means is that one person controls everything in a country or all the decisions in a country, and
that the state under that person's rule is sort of introduced into every facet of life.
Yeah.
And controls everything.
But like I would say that that's not really accurate because Mobutu, it's like the opposite. Mobutu does not want to control stuff.
Right.
He wants to prevent anything from happening.
Right.
Which is like another thing is like this is a quote from that book, he would dither for days, leaving his collaborators in a state of nervous ambiguity, uncertain over what instructions had actually even been issued.
Right.
So like his ministers who he'd shuffle around, they deciding like a policy, they'd ask him and he'd probably give like an answer that was not clear, and then he'd be like, all right, you can leave.
Right.
And then they couldn't do anything because like, did he want us to do this or what did he mean?
Right.
So nothing would happen.
So like I think the point you're getting at with the totalitarian label, there is this presumption of efficiency.
Yeah.
And also that like
or building something.
The totalitarian has a program that they want to
They're
accomplish.
Enforcing some bad thing or some personal thing.
Or really, whatever. Well, like it's something to be constructed or something. Yes. And we would both agree that in our estimation that Mobutu, what he was out to do was basically to protect the grift, and that's about it.
It was like inaction. Right. Is what he valued. It was totalitarian through inaction. He made nothing happen.
I would say he's more laissez-faire in a certain manner.
Because like, especially some of those rural, remote places,
Mm-hmm.
those people didn't really get influenced by what he was doing
Right.
at all. Like in terms of like he wasn't going there and like that was against the point that he didn't want contact with these people
Right. He wanted to prevent the formation of political consciousness
and ideas
and ideas. Yeah.
or wants. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
do whatever you want and out there there's nothing to do besides survive.
Right.
Um, Another thing with by not doing anything and like not having anything accomplished is it was a great way to go to like his European um, benefactors and be like, hey, we need money for these things because look, there's no roads and we got to do
Right.
something. So then they'd cut him a check
Mm-hmm.
and he'd steal it all
He'd
basically.
steal it all,
And that's it was like, and then a few years later, it's like, well, look, these projects are not going anywhere. We need more money. So it's like a way to kind of that's my thing with that. I think
He's using it as sort of a sword and a shield.
Yeah.
Yeah.
made of gold.
Yeah, made of gold. Yeah. So do we want to talk specifically about his political ideology?
Yeah, what was Mobutu like? How did that party um consider itself? Like, he must have said something. So, like, what was the thing that drove that political party forward and like their government?
I assume you're talking about the slogan.
I might be talking about the slogan. Yeah.
Well, I think you should have the honor of getting what's the elevator pitch of Mobutism?
Oh, like in their own words,
Yes.
it's one of the slogans of Mobutism is neither left nor right nor even center, which is the most amazing political like label slogan ever because it's anti-political.
Yeah, right.
It's stating very clearly like that like we're none of these things, and what I take it to mean is this is just about the grift.
Right.
It's not about politics.
Right. This goes back to that whole thing in 1965 where politics and politician were bad words, and so this sort of leaks into his ideology as neither left nor right nor even center, where politics and getting into debates and things like that with people, it just interferes with your ability to steal from the treasury. So
Yeah, and it creates too many expectations and prevents you from
That's a good point.
being like dynamic
right.
and pragmatic and adapting to situations. But really, what that means is whatever is expedient for making a quick buck
Right.
is what we're going to be doing. So we're not tying ourselves to anything.
I think that's a good point. The expectations, because the way that I view Mobutism is that it's a semi-elaborate way to cloak the sort of goal being whatever we're doing right now is the point.
Yeah.
And we just need to prolong that. There's nothing to be attained. Well, there's some things that he says, but in terms of actual policy and things like that, there's nothing more to be done or achieved than to just continue stealing all the fucking money.
Yeah, drawing out everything we can as long as possible.
Yes.
Uh,
So, if I could read, so if you guys remember from earlier, we mentioned the fact that Mobutu's party was called the Popular Movement of the Revolution. You might be wondering, none of this sounds very revolutionary.
yeah, especially not how we've described it all.
Right. So what does revolution mean for Mobutu? Well, this is from Mobutu's wiki page. This is a comment on or a commentary on Mobutu's manifesto. It says that revolution was described as a truly national revolution, essentially pragmatic, which called for the repudiation of both capitalism and communism. So I think the key word there is pragmatic,
Yeah.
pragmatism, which I suppose everybody kind of knows what that means, but it's, we're not going to get connected to ideological things, and
Yeah, there's no money in that really.
there's no money in that. Now, I think that you could say that Mobutu's most kind of outwardly significant contributions to the country is this thing that he called authenticity, which there's kind of two facets to it. The first is
This ties into him being like proud of being African.
right.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, so sort of part of this authenticity campaign was to rename the former colonial place names within the country, and this went for the country itself. So if you've been confused by, you guys are calling it Congo and then you're calling it Zaire, well, as part of this campaign in 1971, Mobutu renamed the country to the Republic of Zaire.
Yeah, which he said was a what was it?
Well, he said that it was an authentic name of the country, and that Congo wasn't.
Yeah.
Or he implied it at least, but
There's some doubt of whether or not that's true, or
yeah,
it's unclear for us.
There's some sources that we read that they opined that this was an odd move for Mobutu because it's thought that the name Zaire comes from a corruption or a Portuguese
like transliterate or mistranslation or something
it's essentially a European term of some degree, and that in reality Congo, it was a name applied to several states in the pre-colonial era, and that really Congo is a indigenous authentic term, whereas Zaire is a European sourced thing. We couldn't find much more information confirming that, so we're just gonna say it's kind of doubtful.
Yeah, it's unclear at least.
Yeah, if you are familiar with this, or if you're from Congo,
please comment.
We'd be very curious to know if there's any truth in that. So for example, if you're unfamiliar with these things, the capital of the Congo, like when it gained its independence, was called Leopoldville, as in Leopold II, the King of Belgium.
The genocidal one.
Yeah. So that city, the capital, was renamed Kinshasa in 1966. Stanleyville was renamed Kisangani, and Elizabethville was renamed Lumumbashi.
Which is extremely insulting, but ties into kind of...
Yes.
Yeah.
So Lumumbashi is named for Patrice Lumumba,
who we should note, because we didn't make this explicit, Mobutu helped kill.
Yes. Yeah. He helped kill him with the Belgians.
Yeah, he worked with them to get Lumumba killed, and then he kind of adopted part of like the words of like the revolution because he was popular.
Yes.
And then named this city after him, which is just like...
I think it ties into what he was talking about in his manifesto. It's essentially pragmatic.
Yeah.
It's him recognizing, okay, Lumumba was a very, very popular leader of the country. There never was one since him, and yeah,
people
sure.
like him, and I want people to like me,
and to see me in a similar light. So we'll rename this colonial era city Lumumbashi.
Yeah.
And also, just crazy, Lumumbashi is in the province of Katanga,
where Lumumba was killed.
Right, fighting against the secession backed by the Belgian mining companies.
Yeah.
Also, we didn't make note of this, but this will become significant in a little bit. Katanga was renamed Shaba.
Yes. He would also... It was like a thing where people in Zaire would adopt new names if they had a name like
Joseph, for example, which was Mobutu's given name.
Which, a funny thing I read in this book is when he was in school, his friends called him Jeff. He was called Jeff. It was like,
why?
They called him Jeff. It was like a friendly thing. It was like, because it's Joseph and Jeff was like a shortening. And
for Jeffrey? Why'd they call him Jeff?
I don't know. They called him Jeff. And it's like school, hey, let's go hang out with Jeff.
I did not know that.
Which is very funny.
That is very funny.
Because that's such a plain European sounding thing.
Yeah, he doesn't look like a Jeff.
Definitely not. And because of the name he gave himself.
Yes, yes, he, as part of this sort of get rid of your European name, what was the name that Mobutu adopted for himself?
What's his full name
His
that he gave?
his
And I'll translate it.
So it's very long. I don't know what language this is in, but
Yeah.
it's typically shortened to Mobutu Sese Seko.
Yeah, and there's more to it, but yeah, it's shortened to that. But what it means is the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, will go from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake.
That's what his name meant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
although he's known as Jeff.
Yeah. Also Jeff. His friends call him Jeff, but otherwise you got to get into the rest of that.
Which is just very like essence of Mobutu to like build himself up, and like it'd be one thing if he was like, even if he did awful stuff and like military campaigns and he won all these battles to take power,
right,
and like continued to do so. But we'll get to that later. But
yes.
like it's just not the case. It's
right.
very funny to think of him as like this warrior, like
who's going around succeeding in things
and fighting. It's just like the opposite is true.
You're right. So sort of part of the we kind of got into this a little bit earlier about appelling the term totalitarian to him. Do we even want to get into this, or do you not want to?
Yeah, we could. It's something, sure.
Well, so if we could return to earlier when Mobutu's manifesto called for the repudiation of capitalism and communism, there's kind of two things to say about that. One, and we'll be getting into this really soon, is that Mobutu's economic policy it's just capitalism. Like that's just like what it is. It's like crony capitalism.
It's even less than that. It's like the bare minimum of what they had of capitalism.
Yeah.
Which is mostly just centered on like they didn't build their own like industry much. It was like mostly just to maintain and expand foreign exploitation of the country.
Yeah, it was like neo-colonialism, which
like,
is
intensely.
Which is, that's just part of capitalism. Yeah. The thing about repudiating communism, my interpretation of this is that because Patrice Lumumba, when he appealed to the USSR for military support in restoring order in the country, he was widely denounced throughout the Western countries as being like a communist stooge and a lackey of the Kremlin. I'm assuming that's what Mobutu's talking about here. So it's basically like he's not engaging with like Marxism or something.
No.
He's just saying, I don't like the Soviet Union.
Especially because surrounding Zaire were a bunch of civil wars or rebel movements that were aligned to the Soviets. And this part ties into the grift where like being anti-communist was extremely lucrative for heads of state during the Cold War because there's a lot of investment in them because they're important to like these major powers who don't like the Soviets.
So right. It's like it doesn't happen often that a head of state of a country fights against his own self-interests and development. And the other thing is, throughout the Cold War period, there is this thing called positive neutralism. And if you've ever heard, it's an organization that still exists. It's called the Non-Aligned Movement. This was a trend among newly independent states where they would first and foremost look out for the interests of their own country first.
Yeah.
And deal with one or the other camp of superpowers sort of secondarily.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of one of the trends...
It's where the third world comes in.
Right.
As like a term, like first, second, and third world. That's what that means.
Right. And now, despite my description of that, it was really common for positive neutralist, or so to speak, non-aligned countries, that is like people or countries engaged in the non-aligned movement. They were normally quite pro-socialist and pro-Soviet.
Typically.
It doesn't mean that they were run by a communist party, but like, easy examples are Sukarno of Indonesia, Nasser of Egypt, Gaddafi of Libya. Their governments were very much left-wing countries. So when he says that in his manifesto, I just take it that he's just trying to project this image of an Africanist leader of an African country,
Yeah.
when in reality it's completely transparently false.
Well, he's trying to make himself seem like he's not a puppet also.
Right.
That he's like they're the masters of like what they're doing in Zaire
Yeah.
completely, and like the influence of capitalism, which they say is like a Western thing, and
Yeah.
like communism, which is like a Russian thing to
Right.
them, or Chinese, depending on what time, is like it's a way to make himself look cooler.
Yeah,
Which is
basically.
a big point for him.
It's clout. Yeah.
But it didn't mean anything.
Do we want to talk about Mobutu's personality cult?
Yeah, so like it ties into how he wants to look cool, right?
Yeah, as opposed to the totalitarian thing.
Yes.
Yes. So
He just wants to be like, he's at all these expensive things. He presents himself as being like a real strong negotiator.
yes.
And like looking out for the interest of people, and like he's an African, like hero sort of.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he didn't want to do anything.
Right.
At all.
Right.
Internationally or domestically. So, yeah, what did he do inside the country to kind of...
So if our whole discussion of what Mobutism is sounds a bit nebulous and just kind of like a facade, well, there's a facade for that facade, which is his personality cult, which is the main thing, it appears from our research. It's the main thing that his party kind of concerned itself with, was just kind of talking about how cool Mobutu is.
Mm-hmm.
Not in terms of like he does things for you, but just that he's inherently awesome.
Yeah.
So there's a quote here. This is taken also from the wiki page for Mobutism. The interior minister named Ngulu Banga Mkongo, he said to supporters of the MPR, quote, "God has sent a great prophet, our prestigious guide Mobutu. This prophet is our liberator, our messiah. Our church is the MPR. Its chief is Mobutu. We respect him like one respects a pope. Our gospel is Mobutism. That is why the crucifixes must be replaced by the image of our messiah." There's one funny thing I want to get into really quick before we discuss it. We have another quotation here. This, I will say that I find this one a little bit doubtful. I would have expected this to be more widely attested to. But according to Mobutu's wiki page, the evening newscast opened with an image of him descending through clouds like a god. I kind of want to imagine it's like animated, kind of.
Yeah, like in Monty Python.
Yeah.
In the Holy Grail, like when God comes, like the clouds are like images, like cutouts that pull away. That's what I picture.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone's listening, because I looked a little bit but not much, if you can find this somehow in an archive or
like
a
on
clip,
a VHS tape or something,
please send it to us.
Yes.
If it's true.
So along with this is his, as sort of described in the prior quotation, his portraits were hung in many places, and government officials wore lapel pins bearing his portrait. So you can find these online pretty easily. They're MPR party like pins.
Okay.
Where it's like his face. And then also he kind of took titles for himself in sort of a royalistic kind of way.
Yeah, and it was like a grab bag. He copied some other people in the world too.
Yeah, so among these, Father of the Nation, that's pretty common. Messiah, that's very uncommon. Guide of the Revolution, Helmsman, this is borrowed from Chairman Mao Zedong from China, which I suspect is also where the party badges are from.
Yeah, and also he made his own like suit design that he said was like a Congolese like
authentic nationalist like dress.
But it was like modeled after like a Chinese Mao suit, they're called. They're like these like outfits that are cool and popular.
Right. Now, if you might be confused, if you've been with us so far saying, I thought this guy hates communism. Well, starting in the early 60s, the Chinese and the Soviets had a huge falling out with each other. and sort of to spite the Soviets, the Chinese
Would occasionally like hang out with their enemies, including sometimes Mobutu.
right. So they would kind of engage with them. There wasn't much substantive. Uh,
It was petty.
it was basically just to piss off the Soviets. So that's why Mobutu feels, he's good to sort of copy
And,
some.
and Mao was super popular.
Yeah,
and like
Mao had great popular resonance throughout the third world as a very significant revolutionary who fought great odds and great adversity to
so he saw Mao and he's like, everyone thinks Mao's cool,
right.
and I want to look cool. So
Right.
it was like a copying thing that he did.
Yeah. One final title that he took for himself is Supreme Combatant,
Which will come up later.
which we will get into is probably the dumbest one there that he chose. Even it's somehow worse than calling yourself the Messiah.
Yeah, it is. Well, speaking of Messiah, like what was the status of the church in Congo is what you've read. Do you have anything for that?
So the things that I read is that by and large, because this is church missionaries were a large part of colonialism, just kind of in general.
They lingered.
Right, and they
Their
lingered.
influence, especially.
And because Belgium is primarily a Catholic country, and there's the whole influence from France as well, I think the number is something like 50% of people are Catholic, and then a large portion of the remainder are sort of African.
Spiritualist, like vague kind of like.
Yeah, but they're Christian also,
Mhm.
and they have kind of parts of them that are kind of drawn from African traditions or new kind of religious movement sort of things. So even though you might think, how can Mobutu run around calling himself the savior, the Messiah? You need to take down crucifixes and put up his portrait. He was still a Catholic.
Nominally.
Nominally.
Stuff I've read is that a lot of the religious figures in the country were also part of the grift. So he would integrate.
Like, I did not know that.
Yeah,
okay.
I should have got some of this, but like the church people who were natives there, who ran stuff, to kind of just be in on it. And he really curtailed the church foreign like Catholic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They had very little influence, especially because the infrastructure is so bad. It's like
how are you gonna get down there and find out
it's
that
like a
Mobutu's
nightmare.
doing all this crazy shit?
It's like you're gonna get around to our people. It's like good luck.
Yeah, I don't think the Pope wants to have to get out and push the Pope mobile on these roads that don't exist. So.
Yeah. So my perspective of it is that it was just very minimized in terms of how intense it was.
Yeah.
Like
it is
Christianity. Like
it is interesting though, given his sort of focus on authentic so kind of piggybacking off of our prior discussion of Mobutu sort of borrowing things from Mao and China. It was a pretty common thing in China. It was going through the Cultural Revolution at the time, where sort of on weekends there was kind of mass sort of movement of volunteer labor throughout the country. And I it could be that he got this idea from China, or it could be from a more sinister source. Mobutu started in 1973 to sort of push or force, if you want to view it that way, what he called obligatory civic work. It was one afternoon a week of compulsory labor on agriculture and things like that. The sort of sinister interpretation of this comes from the fact that this was a prior feature of the Belgian colonial period, where they would have en masse unpaid forced labor. Yeah. But recognizing that there could be that sort of sinister interpretation applied to it, Mobutu described this as a revolutionary attempt to return to the values of communalism and solidarity from traditional society. But there was a huge lack of popular enthusiasm for this. It was called Salongo. And there was, a lot of foot dragging in regards to this. and rather than kind of push the issue, most just kind of local functionaries just kind of didn't care and just kind of looked the other way.
Especially if they were getting paid to.
Right.
So it was like
you don't want to incite.
Yeah. Another thing I read is like through reports, information would be skewed because of people paying each other to do it to get more rewards for like better numbers and stats. They'd fluff it and like falsify stuff.
Oh, so you're saying like they could say, oh yeah, Mobutu, the people in my province, they just went out and they went crazy on working on stuff.
It's like the people reporting to someone who they had to pay off to report higher. It was like this chain. The grift chain goes up like that.
And surely Mobutu's not going to leave his palace.
And he doesn't really care.
And he doesn't really care, yeah. I think we've gone through his relations with the United States, Belgium, and France. There is a kind of funny little anecdote that just kind of shows how mercurial, if you want to use a less sinister term for it, how mercurial Mobutu could be with foreign relations. So there's an incident that occurred in 1974. There was a journalist named Jules Chaumet. He was a left-wing lawyer in Belgium who wrote several books that were highly critical of Mobutu. And Belgium refused at Mobutu's request. They refused to ban the books.
Yeah.
And this led to Mobutu.
He got his feelings hurt.
Yeah, he got his feelings hurt, and he sort of it caused a diplomatic crisis between the two. So,
which is fantastic. He's like, you're making me look less cool there.
Right.
Please ban them. Like, we don't really do that, and like, who cares? Because like, no one cares if you're cool here.
Right.
Like, we know what's up. We're just trading money.
Mm-hmm.
But it really pissed him off. So relations struggled with Belgium for a little bit.
Temporarily. Didn't mean the money stopped coming. It didn't mean that the Belgian economic interests in the country were, suddenly,
affected at all.
Right. No, this is just kind of on the level of words between weird people, and that's kind of
using diplomacy as their like Twitter to like shit talk each other.
It's a good way to put it. It's kind of like Twitter. Now we'll get into sort of much later towards the end of our story about when relations actually were significantly impacted between our trio of the United States, France, and Belgium on the one hand, and Mobutu on the other. But throughout most of Zaire's existence, it was just kind of understood that you're doing the job for us, we'll just keep the money coming, and that's just kind of how their relations were. Do you want to talk about Mobutu's sort of relations with the Soviet Union?
Yeah, well, and like especially in context of his neighbors a little bit, it's like one of the threats to Mobutu personally is people with ideology who know what's up.
Yes.
That he's stealing all this stuff and working for the U.S. and Belgium and France, overthrowing him and like stopping the money and all this stuff. And all around him basically were people who would do that at the drop of a hat.
Yeah.
And those people winning or crossing over into the country and like telling people to do this, it was very possible that this would be a huge issue. So and the Soviets were supporting these groups. So
do we want to talk about like which countries we're talking about?
Sure.
So
briefly, it'll come up more in the next parts.
Yeah. So directly next to Zaire is on the west side is the People's Republic of the Congo, which was a Soviet-aligned socialist country.
That gets confusing, so we haven't mentioned it much.
This never ever comes up in our research, what went on between these two, but we're just noting it, and we're never going to mention it again.
Yeah.
The next one is in 1975, the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola fought a national liberation war against the Portuguese.
Who I should note, the Portuguese were like Britain and to some degree other countries were a little less militaristic with keeping their colonies. Some of them kind of did different things to whatever. Portugal was not like that. Portugal was very violent and started
they
major
fought
wars
to the end. Yeah. So So yeah, that new leftist pro-Soviet government came to power in Angola in 1975. In the south is Zambia, which Zambia was not outwardly a like socialist country, but it heavily supported and played a role as a base for the African National Congress and the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, which were fighting against apartheid South Africa.
Basically, it was a truly neutralish,
Yeah,
like, but anti-colonial was their main thing. So they didn't they helped these forces
yeah.
that were aligned with the Soviets.
They also assisted the anti-apartheid struggle in Zimbabwe as
Yes.
well. So I guess next on the list would be Tanzania, which was run by the president's name was Julius Nyerere.
Yeah.
He was not a Marxist, but he was very friendly with anti-colonial struggles. He was a leftist. He was a socialist. Elsewhere on the continent, he had a very acrimonious relationship with Libya.
Which is to the north. It's like the African or the Arabic part of Africa.
Yeah,
It's like the very north of the country.
and
And underneath them was a country that
Chad, which they backed rival sides in a civil war in Chad.
and the leader of Libya uh, was very anti-colonial and like pro all of Mobutu's enemies
Yes,
and hated Mobutu.
hated him. Yes, and he, in fact, if we want to read this quotation, speaking in Burundi in May 1985, the Libyan leader, he was a guy called Muammar Gaddafi, called on the Zairean population to physically eliminate Mobutu.
Which is just the funniest way to phrase
really
it.
good. Yeah.
Gaddafi had a lot of funny things he said, but that was one that stuck out to me. Just
Yes.
physically eliminate. It's like such a great image of him giving a speech to people.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Like to dismember him or something.
Yeah.
It's very colorful.
Like, go get him. Yeah, so what was their relation? Because the Soviets were backing all these anti-colonials. What was their relationship with them like?
So, obviously, very, very negative, but according to this is from Mobutu's wiki, Mobutu viewed the Soviet presence. They're talking about the diplomatic presence. So there was an embassy of the Soviet Union in Kinshasa. Viewed the Soviet presence as advantageous for two reasons. It allowed him to maintain an image of non-alignment, and it provided a convenient scapegoat for problems at home. For example, in 1970, he expelled 4 Soviet diplomats for carrying out quote-unquote subversive activities. And in 1971, 20 Soviet officials were declared persona non grata for allegedly instigating student demonstrations at Lovanium University. So it's basically just like he allowed them there to just kind of assist in the grift.
Yeah, it was pragmatic to have them around.
Pragmatic, yeah.
He was like, hey, something went wrong.
The Russians probably.
They snuck out of the embassy and they told people that I was screwing them, which is of course not true.
Of course, yeah.
I can't believe they've done this, and he like sends them away temporarily.
Yeah.
It's a big target to hoist blame onto.
Yeah. Do you want to get into
So so there's like another thing is like with like this might not be the right spot for it fully, but I'm gonna go into it just a little, like with people in and on the grift were even people outside the country. So like ambassadors would also be paid and stuff. And this is one of my things that I've shared already off podcast, but this is one of my favorite things. It's later in the history of Zaire, there was a guy in opposition like, talking badly about Mobutu and like trying to make his own presence better. But it's said that he was a ambassador to Japan. He was a vocal critic. And one great example of how everyone got in on the grift, no matter what, is when property value in Japan went high, he was in Japan as the ambassador and he sold the embassy because he made a quick buck on it. and he continued to be a presence in the country after. Like, it wasn't like they brought him back and were like, this is unacceptable.
Why did you do this? Yeah.
It's ludicrous to think of like a diplomat selling the embassy without knowledge from the country. Like, how did that even happen?
You'd think it would be the property of the state.
You think.
And that, like, I've never heard of an embassy being sold by an ambassador before.
My interpretation was that the land was like arranged by the government of the country.
Yeah.
But I just imagine that they picked cheaper land or something, or I don't know what happened here. But
I wonder what, like, the people he sold it to thought.
yeah.
Or maybe he just didn't tell them.
Yeah. Or you like say, oh, they're cool with this, don't worry.
Right,
Or
we're building one down the street or
yeah.
something.
Or maybe what I think happened too is like we got back, people found out about this. He's like, well, where's my cut?
Yeah.
Vutu is like, didn't give a fuck. He's like, all right.
He doesn't care that
cut me in.
potentially is the country's relations with its significant economic partner, Japan, could possibly be interrupted or disrupted. He probably just wanted his cut.
Or just how humiliating that story is.
Yeah.
Like exposing Mobutuism in practice that way.
Yeah. Because in any other situation I can imagine, that would be big news as a joke piece, but that the president of the country in question would be furious.
Yeah.
You sold the embassy and just pocketed it.
Yeah. It's like people are going to know about this.
Yeah.
Like, what the hell? But it didn't happen.
That's not what he's concerned with. So do we want to move on to the economy?
Yeah, we could do that.
Okay.
So we'll get back to some foreign relations because it ties into military stuff.
Yeah.
But basically, yeah, the foreign, I guess to cap it off, the foreign relations outside of the connection to Belgian, French, and United States economic and geopolitical interests were really not important.
No.
He didn't care about it. He's like,
yeah, because Zaire didn't trade with its neighbors. It's just kind of a normal neo-colonial and colonial sort of condition that the colonies don't trade with each other or with their neighbors. They trade with the metropolis
at a really good rate.
Yeah.
Like they get, yeah.
So, that's talking about trade relations, but it goes with diplomatic relations as well.
And, in the context of the Cold War, right, a lot of these like U.S. aligned people would be expected to contribute to the fight against Soviet interests a lot.
Right.
We'll get into some of that later, but Zaire didn't really. They did a little bit.
Yeah.
At pressure, but it was very half-hearted and
disastrous.
We'll get to that, but it was like he didn't really want to get involved in stuff because he didn't want to bring attention to people around him that could hurt him. So
right.
It's just like, yeah. So yeah, the next part.
So quite a while ago, when talking about ideology, I mentioned that there were kind of two facets to this authenticity campaign. So the first one, if you'll recall, was the renaming of place names and personal names. The second one is what is referred to as Zaireanization. Do you want to just give a brief summary of like what that was?
You can go ahead and do that. Yeah.
So, sort of in the course of researching these things and, this Cold War era, Third World movements and stuff, invariably you will come upon a policy called nationalization. So normally what this entails is that the in like a Cold War national liberation context.
Yeah, it's like that foreign or previous colonial powers own a lot of the business and interests in the country.
Right, and land.
And it's not just that they own it and make money off it, but the decision making benefits those powers.
Right.
And not the local people or the country. So it's necessary usually to take that away from them,
right,
so that they can build their country in their own interest.
And normally, so that process is called nationalization. Normally, those things are then run by the state, or if it's land, it's redistributed among like peasants and stuff. So frequently, you will see this Zaireanization thing referred to as nationalization. I don't think that's accurate.
It's a little misleading because
It's-
it's got a grift quality to it.
Yes, so I would call this reprivatization.
Yeah.
So it went from private European owners to private Zairean owners, and then as we'll get to, they found this compromise where 60% went to the European owners.
There and back again.
Yes, it was there and back again, but these things weren't really run by the state.
No.
So now you might be thinking, well, what Zairean owners did this go to? How did they, what was the process for who got
Normally
what?
it's like, you have this company or like these mines or logging stuff or anything like that. Like,
Mhm.
who can run this?
Yeah.
Like, was not like that in this case.
No, so Mobutu gave these things over to what he called sons of the country. And basically what that meant is, as we've gone over many, many times, it's, members of his political party, government officials, his goons, basically.
His friends,
Yeah, so
his enemies.
yeah, his enemies.
That's another thing. He'd give stuff to people who didn't like him or were in opposition.
Mhm.
Basically, it makes them complicit and they just stop fighting him.
Yeah, because he's got dirt on literally everybody.
Yeah, because once you take stuff, what are you going to say? I'm corrupt? Look
Right.
at, I did, even though he set it up, it's like, well, look what you did.
Yeah. So this amounted to about 300 people. So the major plantations and ranches and large commercial business enterprises were given to the political elite, essentially. And then smaller scale economic ventures were given to sort of local notables in the provinces.
People who could think Mobutu's cool or calm everyone else around them.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a quotation from the Country Study. It said the effects of this were that Zaireanization engendered economic disaster on an unprecedented scale. In a matter of months, commercial networks were utterly disrupted, massive layoffs were reported, and shortages of basic commodities became increasingly widespread. Along with liquidation of assets, asset stripping in the retail sector became commonplace. As the Zairean economy went into a tailspin, Mobutu finally came to realize the magnitude of the catastrophe ushered in by Zaireanization. In November 1975, he announced the creation of a stabilization committee in charge of examining a retrocession formula designed to return a substantial portion of Zaireanized enterprises to their original owners. And the sort of formula they agreed to was that Europeans, or the former owners, which were all Europeans basically, would get 60%, and then the Zaireans would get 40%. So, from all of that process and disaster, it basically very little changed.
Yeah.
And also, you might be wondering, why did this cause such a disaster? Well, it was because the sort of management and ownership and the whole
Very laissez-faire.
yeah, it was given to people that they had no idea how to run these things or have any interest in running
Yeah,
them.
some people just didn't want it, but they're like, just take it, dude.
Right.
We're getting rid of all of it.
Must have been awful being like one of the workers where it's like, why can't this just be like any other like country where it's like, why not just nationalize it and let the workers who actually work there and know what's happening? Why don't you let them manage it?
Train people to do stuff
Yeah.
to support the country instead of giving it to people who don't know or care about it.
And it results in you just losing your livelihood.
Yeah. Like one of the reasons it was reversed also is because a lot of the people, like, this pissed off his benefactors in Europe and the
Yes.
US. And the insinuation is that he'd be getting less money.
Right.
Either in aid or from these things that he Zaireanized.
Right.
Would be making less money for him to steal.
Yeah.
So he scrambled to save his wallet, basically.
Yeah, basically. So do we want to move into the Zairean armed forces?
Yeah, we could do that. I mean, like, what else about the economy could we get into? Like, what's relevant? Like, it really
Yeah.
the Belgian mining stuff and like all of the resource extraction was really the point
Yeah.
for like Europe and like even Mobutu. Like,
Yeah.
that stuff was not really even interacted with much.
Right. It was Mobutu, you can do whatever you want, just don't get involved with this. And even then, the it's a little confusing to make sense out of, but the largest Belgian mining company in Shaba province was actually nationalized in the late 60s. But it was turned into a state-owned company called Gecko Mines, so it was not reprivatized.
Yeah.
However, the arrangement of it is not the sort of normal way these things occur. So, for example, the external marketing of the things produced and the management of it was still dictated by the Belgians.
Yeah.
And so along with that is that in the south of the country, there were thousands of Belgian technicians and managers that were affiliated with with the mining sort of enterprise. So even though, and this is a big part of his sort of ideology, is economic independence.
It was anything but.
It was anything but, yeah.
It was like, especially because I don't know where I was going with that.
Well, like with the Zaireanization thing, none of that shit mattered.
Yeah.
What really mattered was the minerals and the petroleum.
Yeah, and like one avenue for this Belgian run thing, basically Belgian run, like national company, was that it made it very easy for Mobutu to steal from,
Yes.
and it was like acknowledged. Like people were not in Europe who ran these things were not like unaware of this. They accepted that Mobutu's going to be stealing stuff from things that they either give them or from this thing, the mining stuff.
Yeah.
And it was just part of the cost.
Yes. It was, this is part of the cost of we don't want a socialist government in power here that restricts or totally blocks Western companies' access to exploit these resources.
And we're making so much money off this deal anyway.
Yeah, this is the largest cobalt producer in the world. They have just oodles and oodles of copper.
Yeah.
And manganese and just all sorts of rare minerals. And we don't want this cash cow cut off. So if he needs to take several $1 billion from time to time, then whatever.
It's a business expense.
Yes.
Like another example of that is where they're just aware of it is like towards the end, which we'll go into more later, but like people who worked there or even were around these company places, mines and stuff, would steal equipment.
Yes.
And then like I can imagine show up the next few days and just resell it to the Belgian managers.
Yes.
Like, hey, you need this like mining equipment. It's like, how'd you get that?
Right.
They knew that it was stolen.
Right.
And they bought it back. And they're like, hey, it was just what we had to do.
It's more of that the sort of social repercussions of making the whole state about stealing shit.
Yeah. The grift seeping down into like just what you have to do or what people just did and it was acceptable.
Right.
Steal a little bit.
And you might be thinking, well, why would they need to steal if they got paid on time? Well, of course they weren't paid on time.
Yeah.
And the unions in the country were all directly affiliated to Mobutu's party.
Yeah.
And so there were some strike actions that I could see throughout history, but the large Belgian interests, no.
Yeah,
no.
That stuff was never touched.
They weren't going on strike to say, Mobutu, give us our goddamn money. Because, they'd probably just be left out to dry. So.
Yeah. So military stuff. Which involves some history and foreign policy too, but it's I think it's worth having its own section.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, my kind of
well, how was the military arranged in Zaire? It's a big country, we should note. We didn't say how big it was population wise.
Very large.
Like over 100 million people.
Yes, very large. Tons of people, many borders with states that it kind of varied over time, but by and large they had very negative relations with Zaire.
Yes.
So potential enemies. You might be shocked to learn that the Zairean army, which we'll refer to as the FAZ, that's French acronym for Armed Forces of Zaire, or Zairean Armed Forces, had a shockingly small military.
Yeah, surrounded by enemies, and with stereotypical strong man in the third world,
yep.
who's like a U.S. puppet, have like big bombastic military
Right.
presence. This was not the case
This
here.
was not the case. And it's kind of very very peculiar. So
To say the least.
now you might be thinking, well, I thought he was, this big corrupt dictator guy. Well, he did have an entire division of the army devoted to him. It was called the Special Presidential Division. This is the one, it was run by his cousin. Is that right?
Yeah, most of the positions that were really important to him were run by some family member because he could trust them more.
Yeah.
It's just how he did it.
So this was the only like formation of the army that was typically paid on time. Uh, there's some exceptions to that, which we'll get into towards the end.
And also equipped properly
Right.
at all.
Right. There was another division of the army called the Kamanyola Division, which it takes its name from a battle. There's not much information you can find out about this battle, but apparently it was in 1964 or 1965. It's a place where there was a battle against Maoist rebels in the east of the country. Now the funny thing with this is this battle lent its name to this division, but it also lent its name to Mobutu's yacht that he would go hang out on the Congo River in.
Yeah. He really liked this battle's name because he participated in it, and he kind of built up that he was like super important in this battle.
Well, he's the supreme combatant.
Yeah.
So he's got to let you know with the name of the division. So normally it would be called like the 1st Infantry Division or something like that. This was literally just named for the battle. Curiously, I couldn't find much information on his participation in this battle. So
No.
but anyways, in addition to this, so those were the two largest formations of the army. There was also so this is going by 1988. There were 2 airborne brigades, a commando, what was called a commando brigade.
Cool name.
Yeah, an armored brigade and 3 infantry brigades. For a country of this size, with so many borders, with so many people, that is a shockingly small army. But it gets worse, because half of the brigade-sized units were just slightly larger than a standard battalion in the armies of most other countries.
That's extremely small.
Extremely small. And then both divisions were less than half the size of a standard division in the armies of other countries.
So it's like these are not even accurate to what you picture when you picture these military formations. They're smaller.
Right. If you're not very conversant with military terms, what would you liken this to?
It's like calling a quarter a dime, sort of, and then
Yeah.
a dime a penny. It's like,
Yeah.
or something similar. It's like just degrees smaller.
Right.
In already that amount, normal sized would be
Yeah.
so small, especially considering their neighbors and the conflict. It's just can't picture it. I
Yeah.
can't do it.
Now the sort of disposition of these forces, more than half of them were stationed, by the Belgian economic interests in the south.
Yeah, they protected the mines and,
yeah.
and stuff like that.
Yep. Some of the rest were near the capital, Kinshasa. That's especially where the presidential division was located.
Yeah, because that's where he was a lot.
And then there was very, very few units in the east of the country. And this, to sort of tie back around to our whole totalitarianism discussion, I think it just kind of goes with the way that the term is used. But wouldn't you think a totalitarian government would have very strong control over its borders?
Yeah, very military presence in all the towns, especially where there's rebels and like
Right.
conflict in the neighboring countries that, no matter what their ideology, could spill over and
Right.
cause problems.
That's not the case here. Zaire had very porous borders, and one of the reasons for it, and if you've seen Democratic Republic of the Congo mentioned in the news in the last couple of years, you've almost certainly seen it mentioned in connection with something called conflict diamonds or something like that, which is, kind of local warlords smuggling precious minerals and things like that out of the country. Well, that's what Mobutu's sort of gang would do.
Yeah.
Is there were porous borders on purpose to enable the grift.
Yeah, and then they'd kick up to him.
Yeah.
And they also had to do that because he wasn't paying them much.
Right.
One of the reasons that their equipment was so we'll get to that, but like I mentioned, some of these, even this small army, a lot of it was poorly equipped mostly.
Yes.
One of the reasons is because it was not looked after, but specifically because people would steal parts of it to resell.
Yeah.
Or to sell to rebel groups, even opposing ones sometimes, like communist rebels, just because they made some money off of it.
Yeah.
Um,
They have no stake in this fight.
So they would have like very little equipment that they should have for an already very small fighting group.
Yeah.
It was just like comedically.
Especially given the amount of aid given by the Western countries to Mobutu. There's no reason.
They were pouring money and equipment in, and when it went missing, they would just send more.
Yeah.
Constantly. That was just part of the grift.
And you might be thinking, well, why would they do that? You'd think they'd have greater sort of scrutiny on these things. It's like, well, Western arms companies, they get to just redeliver the same thing. The taxpayers are paying for it, so who cares?
Yeah, it's our own grift that is kind of like that too, but a less talked about one.
Do we want to talk about the... Okay, so this is a sort of specific instance of the grift in the army.
Yeah.
Do you want to read this?
You do the first one, go ahead.
Okay, so this is from the Zaire country study. It says that a considerable portion of military equipment is not operational. So they're talking back in the 80s or 90s. Primarily as a result of shortages of spare parts, poor maintenance, and theft. For example, the tanks of the 1st Armored Brigade often have a non-operational rate approaching 70 to 80%. After a visit by a Chinese technical team in 1985, most of the tanks operated, but such an improved status generally has not lasted long beyond the departure of the visiting team.
So it's like they showed up, they're like, let's get all your tanks running for your 1 armored division in a country that I imagine it's very hard to use tanks because they don't build roads at all. Like, I imagine these were only stationed in the cities.
Yeah, but even then, it's like, it's not a good idea to have tanks in cities. So I'm not really sure what the point of this unit was.
Me neither, but...
Do you want to read the rest of that?
Yeah, well, like I'm just picturing, like they showed up, they said, hey, you're all set. We fixed all your tanks. You guys are good to go. And as soon as they got on the plane, the teams there who were not being paid very well or at all were like, okay, what can we steal? They just brought in a bunch of stuff. They just started disassembling it before they even left the country.
Oh, sort of along with this, in the research I did, it uniformly said that the 1st Armored Brigade had 100 tanks.
Yeah.
So when it says that there's a non-operational rate of 80%, that means 20 tanks worked at a given point in time, which is like, for this kind, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's like you couldn't keep 100 tanks operational.
Right.
Shocking. Go ahead and do the rest.
You want me to read the rest?
Yeah, I'm going to do the next thing.
Okay, so this is continuing the same quotation. The most important factor that negatively affects maintenance is the low and irregular pay that soldiers receive, resulting in the theft and sale of spare parts and even basic equipment to supplement their meager salaries. When not stealing spare parts and equipment, maintenance personnel often spend the better part of their duty day, looking for other ways to profit.
So they're like at work.
Yeah.
But like instead of being on the job doing what they need to be doing, they're doing side hustles at work. They're like selling stuff. Like I don't know what all of it would be, but like they're just.
Oh, we'll get into it in a little bit. We have another quote.
Yeah, go ahead.
American maintenance teams working in Zaire found that providing a free lunch to the workforce was a good, sometimes the only technique to motivate personnel to work at least half of the duty day. Which is like, they're in a barracks. Don't they get food?
There's like a school without a free lunch program. It was like, it's kind of Mobutism though. He's like, you got to be pragmatic. Go get your lunch wherever you want. You can leave campus.
Or maybe they did have like a mess hall and stuff, but the cook
food
was selling it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You was selling it or stealing it?
Yeah.
Go. All the stuff's gone.
I don't know what to tell you guys.
Yeah. And it's like, you'd think like, why wouldn't this be cracked down on? Like, again, this goes into all of it. This is kind of just the way you do it.
Right.
In Mobutism. Yeah. It was
every facet of life doesn't matter.
Like, figure it out.
Should be profited.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you were just talking about like the soldiers like side hustles.
Yeah, so like the soldiers apparently behaved like an occupying force sometimes, where they'd just kind of rob the local people. One thing was that they'd set up like endless roadblocks, like even on the shoddy and like disrepaired roads that there
Mhm.
were, there'd be like a lot of checkpoints.
To extract the
Yeah,
toll from.
they're like
Yeah.
bandits. So
Yeah.
like you'd go, it's like a toll booth, but like with people with guns.
Yeah.
And they'd like take stuff from people as you move through. Um, it's like drivers and like any passing travelers would just have to like indirect Mobutu grift
Yeah.
from the soldiers that he's not paying,
Right.
who are not working.
Right.
It's like a really funny chain of scamming people that has just trickled down from him.
Yeah.